The reasons why the Syrian civil war is the most violent one in the region. The first reason for the high level of violence is the brutal repression of the protests by the regime in the initial period. This is mainly due to the minority character of the ruling regime, which perceived the uprising from a sectarian viewpoint and deemed losing the power as a life and death issue. Secondly, generous military support both the regime and the rebels gained from their foreign patrons both endured the conflict and increased the level of violence. Foreign countries did not only support their allies within Syria but also directly intervened in the conflicts on many occasions. The high interest of global and regional powers on Syria mainly stems from its geostrategic location in the heart of the Middle East. Lastly, the fragmented nature of the opposition, which fights both against the government and among themselves, makes the level of violence high in the country. In this environment, extremist groups quickly came to the fore and terrified both the Syrian society and the international community with their brutal terror tactics. The roles and interests of the GCC countries in Yemen's civil war. GCC is the most important external actor in Yemen's civil war. The military intervention of the GCC-led international coalition in March 2015 was the most critical moment at the start of the war as it prevented the total takeover of the country by the Houthi rebels. Nevertheless, the operation fell short of winning a decisive victory against the Houthis in the capital Sana'a in the north of the country. While all GCC countries perceive a serious threat from the rise of the Zaidi Shiite Houthi movement in Yemen and suspect its ties with Iran, they are not in full consensus about which actor to support against it. While Saudis support Hadi and Islah Party, UAE suspects the Islamist tendencies of the Islah Party and develops a special relationship with the STC, which has strong separatist tendencies. The Cooperation Council for the Arab States of the Gulf, originally, and still colloquially, known as the Gulf Cooperation Council, is a regional intergovernmental political and economic union consisting of all Arab states of the Persian Gulf, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, except Iraq. The charter of the GCC was signed on May 25, 1981, formally establishing the institution. All current member states are monarchies, including 3 constitutional monarchies, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain, 2 absolute monarchies, Saudi Arabia and Oman, and 1 federal monarchy, the United Arab Emirates, which is composed of 7 member states, each of which is an absolute monarchy with its own emir. There have been discussions regarding the future membership of Jordan, Morocco, and Yemen. Why and how the Egyptian military seized power on July 3, 2013 by a coup d'état. It is possible to say that the 2013 military coup occurred in Egypt as a consequence of different factors. After coming into power in 2012 as a result of a democratic election, President Morsi took several important legal and political steps that alienated both liberal secular parts of the society and the military establishment, such as the adoption of a much objected constitution and issuing a controversial presidential decree which granted himself immunity. Also, the president made a regulation related to the Suez Canal corridor development project that would damage the military's economic privileges. Nevertheless, one of the most critical problems was the deepening of economic difficulties such as fuel shortages, increasing food prices, and electricity blackouts in the country. As a combination of these factors, the Tamarid Movement organized widespread anti-brotherhood demonstrations on June 30, 2013 by demanding the resignation of Morsi. In this conjuncture, the Egyptian military staged a coup and ended the democratic order. The similarities in the ruling regime's initial response to the uprisings. The initial response of the ruling regimes to the uprisings was similar in many ways. First of all 6 regimes used security forces in order to suppress the protest in the initial period. The level of force used in this process changed from country to country, but this does not change their character. Secondly, when suppression failed, all regimes offered some degree of concessions to quell the protests. The degree of concessions changed from country to country, yet the opposition refused all of them as they were either too little or too late. After the failure of this accommodation tactic, fates of the regimes started to diverge by the degree of international and domestic support they were able to garner. The effects of social media on the outbreak of the Arab Uprisings. First of all, it must be underlined that although the social media had a quite important role during the 2011 uprising, it does not mean that the Arab uprising was a direct product of the social media. On the contrary, the uprisings erupted in many Arab countries as a result of the combination of structural economic and political difficulties. Nonetheless, the different social media channels like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube were highly used by the activists during the uprisings. Circulating the videos showing the state violence, the activists could manage to organize effective mobilization in terms of the resistance to authoritarianism. Besides, it became possible to create new communication channels by social media among the protesters, while the regimes restricted the spreading of accurate information by keeping the mass media under control. Arab countries where the uprisings were unable to topple the ruling regimes. In Bahrain and Syria, the ruling regimes were able to hold on power despite massive anti-regime uprisings in 2011. The first reason for their resilience is the minority characteristic of the regimes, which made their power base more consolidated in the face of growing protests. As a result, they were not weakened by critical defections. The second reason for their resilience is the generous support provided by their foreign allies. Although both regimes have survived the uprisings so far, the expense paid by Syrians was far higher than that of Bahrainis. Since 2012, Syria has been dragged into a bloody internationalized civil war with various fighting parties and various foreign sponsors. Armed rebels initially gained control of the countryside in the north and east of the country, but they were gradually sidelined by extremist groups such as al-Nusra and ISIL. Meanwhile, PKK-affiliated YPG gained control of certain towns in northern Syria and allied with the US in the fight against ISIL. The turning point of the war was the direct military intervention of Russia on the side of the regime in 2015. In the following years, the regime gradually recaptured much of the areas it lost to the rebels except for Idlib, which became the subject of protracted negotiations and complicated deals between Turkey and Russia. In the same period, Turkey established its safe zones in 3 different locations along its borders with Syria. Arab countries where the uprisings ended up in total state collapse and civil war. Yemen and Libya differed from other countries that experienced anti-regime uprisings in 3 ways. Firstly, they suffered critical divisions within the regimes during the uprisings. Secondly, their leaders gave up power only after the foreign intervention. Thirdly, uprisings in both countries ended up in total state collapse and civil war in the following years. Reasons for these outcomes can be found in weak state structures that are exploited by leaders of both countries. Roots of weak state structures are threefold. First of all, both countries are located in geographies that are extremely difficult to govern. Secondly, there are significant inter-regional and intra-societal differences within each country that limits the construction of national identity. Lastly, both regimes have rentier natures. In the case of Yemen, the civil war started as a result of the Houthi takeover of the capital Sana'a in 2014. In response to President Hadi's calls for support, a GCC-led international coalition intervened in the conflict against the Houthis in March 2015. The Houthis were supported by former President Saleh, while the Southern Movement and Islah Party took Hadi's side. Nevertheless, both camps of the conflict suffered from internal divisions. As the civil war entered into its 5th year with no conclusive results, Yemen still suffers the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. The Tunisian successful transition process to democracy and the Egyptian failed democratization. Unlike other countries, Tunisia and Egypt experienced no civil war or state collapse after the uprisings despite their divergent paths concerning democratization. The Tunisian transition process to democracy remained stable based on a reconciliation policy between the different political actors, while Egyptian politics have gained a military-based authoritarian character. Egyptian army toppled democratically elected President Morsi with a military coup in 2013, and Defense Minister Abdel Fattah al-Sisi became the new president in 2014 superficial elections, which were neither free nor fair. In the following years, Sisi continued to consolidate his authoritarian rule with the help of the military and formed a new military tutelage in Egypt. The reasons for the difference between Tunisian and Egyptian experiences during the transition period are threefold: the nature of trade unions and their impacts on the political sphere, the different characteristics of civil-military relations, and the differences between Islamist movements, mainly between the Muslim Brotherhood and Ennahda movement. The trajectory of the 2011 uprisings in different Arab countries. Arab uprisings started in Tunisia in late 2010. Peaceful protests were able to topple the ruling regime in less than a month. The post-uprising period was also relatively peaceful and resulted in the adoption of a democratic constitution in 2014. The second stop of the uprising was Egypt, where the position of the military played a more decisive role in the fall of Hosni Mubarak. Military and the Muslim Brotherhood stood out as major players in the post-uprising period, which entered into a new phase with the election of Mohamed Morsi as the new president in 2012. The third stop of the uprisings was Yemen. Although defections from his regime considerably weakened President Ali Abdullah Saleh during the protests, he refused to give up power until the intervention of GCC, which feared rising anarchy in its neighborhood. The fourth stop of the uprisings was Bahrain, where mostly Shiite protesters rose against the Sunni ruling family. It was the military intervention of the GCC that saved the Bahraini regime. The fifth stop of the uprisings was Libya. Protests against the Gaddafi regime quickly turned into an armed rebellion due to the brutal repression of the regime and a high number of defections in the army. Rebels were able to topple Gaddafi only after the military intervention of NATO. The last stop of the uprising was Syria, where protesters took up arms in response to the brutal suppression of the regime. Though several international diplomatic initiatives were undertaken in 2012, none of them was successful in ending the violence in the country. The main reasons for the 2011 Arab uprisings. The characteristic feature of the Arab uprisings was to resist the corrupt and authoritarian regimes and to defeat the long-term ruling leaders. The resistance to the authoritarian regimes emerged as a combination of two embedded factors and a catalyzer element. First factor was economic difficulties such as poverty and unemployment problems, especially among the young and educated people. Secondly, political reasons, mainly the absence of democracy and states' systematic brutality against the opponents, increased public anger. Finally, the catalyzer element was basically the social media due to its facilitating role during the outbreak of the uprisings. This was mainly because the social media channels were used very effectively in bringing people together, fixing gatherings time and space when the regimes demolished the freedom of organization and the independence of mass media. The Arab uprisings start first in Tunisia. Mohamed Morsi was the president of Egypt when the military coup took place on June 3, 2013. Price increase in food grains had a direct impact on the outbreak of the widespread protests in 2011 in the Arab world. The 2011 uprising did not cause any civil war in Tunisia and Egypt. The common goal of the protests across the Arab world during the 2011 uprising was downfalling of the regime. Joint meeting parties played a pioneering role in mobilizing the protests in Yemen. The central state collapsed as a consequence of a NATO-led military campaign. The Yemen civil war started in 2015. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is the most effective armed group in Idlib. Russia, Turkey, and Iran have been the major partners of Astana peace talks since 2017. Intifada. The Arabic root word has different meanings. To shudder, shiver. To shake off, shake out. To recover, recuperate. But it gained a special meaning to directly define the Palestinian civil resistance against Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip in 1987. The term Arab Spring describing the massive uprisings was firstly used by a social scientist, Mark Lynch, in his article titled Obama's Arab Spring in an American magazine, Foreign Policy. Then, this term began to be widely used in Western-oriented journals, magazines, and the mainstream media, but not in the Arab world. Intifada means opening in Arabic. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat announced Intifada referring to the neoliberalization of the Egyptian economy in the October paper of April 1974. The bread riots of the 1970s and 1980s can also be defined with the term IMF riots because the bread riots took place as a consequence of neoliberal policies which was mainly conducted by the IMF. The April 6 Youth Movement. The name of this movement came from the date of 2008 strikes in Egypt. After the Tunisian uprising ousted Ben Ali from power, the April 6 Youth Movement called for a rally against the authoritarian Mubarak regime in the early 2011 by using social media channels, mainly their Facebook page. We Are All Khaled said Facebook page was set up by Wael Ghonim, a Google marketing manager, in order to attract public attention to the state violence. Intifada movement is the successor of the Islamic Tendency movement, formed by Rajd Ghannouchi in 1981. In December 1988, the movement changed its name to Intifada, Renaissance. Ghannouchi was exiled in London since 1989 and immediately returned to Tunis following the removal of Ben Ali in January 2011. Bahrain is currently the only Arab country that has a Shiite majority but Sunni rulers. Joint Meeting Parties is a coalition of Islamist, leftist, and nationalist opposition parties that were founded in 2002, and included both Islamist Islah Party and leftist Yemen Socialist Party. Yemen is the poorest country in the MENA region. It is ranked 199th, out of 228 nations, in terms of GDP per capita. The Responsibility to Protect, RTOP or R2P, is a new international security and human rights norm to address the international community's failure to prevent and stop genocides, war crimes, ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity. Tamarid Movement. Tamarid, which means rebellion in Arabic, was established in April 2013 as a grassroots social movement to call for President Morsi's resignation by starting a petition campaign all over the country. Mohamed Morsi was the only civilian and democratically elected president of Egypt among his predecessors and successor. After his overthrow, Morsi faced several trials with the accusations of espionage, terrorism, and prison break during the 2011 protests, and he was sentenced to the death penalty. He tragically died as a result of a heart attack in the middle of the trial in June 2019 before his sentence was imposed. The term weak state, is generally used to define a state that is weak in its core functions of providing security to its citizens, security gap, providing basic services to its citizens, capacity gap, and having legitimacy among its people, legitimacy gap. Patrimonialism is a form of political domination described by Max Weber, in which authority rests on the personal and bureaucratic power exercised by a royal household, where that power is formally arbitrary and under the direct control of the ruler. Houthi movement, also known as Ansarullah movement, is a predominantly Zaydi Shiite tribal movement centered in the city of Sa'da in northern Yemen. Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi founded it in 1992. The movement has been fighting against the Yemeni government since 2004. After losing the civil war in 1994, Southern separatists in Yemen pursued their political goals peacefully by forming the Southern Movement, al-Hirak al-Janubi, in 2007. Yemen suffers the worst humanitarian crisis in the world since the outbreak of the civil war in 2015. According to the UN, 17.8 million people lack access to safe water and sanitation, and 19.7 million lack access to adequate health care. Russia has had a strategic naval base in Tartus since 1971, and has actively been using Hmyim Air Base in Latakia since 2015. The reports of the UN monitors did not mention the perpetrator of the chemical attack in eastern Gaudha. Chemical weapons were used 2 more times during the war in the following years.